Hello, everybody. I'm David Harrelson. Is my audio on?
We can hear you.
Oh, you can. Thank you. That's helpful. I seem to have lost Zoom. Let's try to get back. All right. It's good to meet all of you. I see a couple familiar faces and some folks I don't probably know. You may have read my bio, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I'm the Cultural Resources Department Manager. And that means that I help lead the teams that run our museum, but also do historic preservation work throughout our homelands. Other things that I'm involved with, I'm on the State Advisory Committee for Historic Preservation, and I was just appointed to the Oregon Arts Commission. So historic preservation and art are things that are really important to me, but also my tribe is. So I'm a tribal member. I'm from the Bean, Menard, Shangretta family here on the Grand Ronde Reservation. My grandmother was a lifelong educator at Chemawa Indian School, and I went to school for history. So I'm not per se an educator myself. I'm more of an administrator-like type, but I love to talk to people about history, and hopefully I can just share kind of a basic primer on the tribe. Of course, since I'm so passionate about it, sometimes I get into tangents and I get passionate and excited about things. So one of the ways that I actually like to start is I like to start with a video that is just a 5-minute snippet of, that's interesting, a 5-minute snippet of Spirit Mountain Community Fund did a video about tribal history. So I'm going to share that and try sound, and give me a thumbs down if you can't hear the sound when I open it up. Apologies, it looks like I have to go track down where it was at in order to get the best audio quality. All right.
By 1954, when the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde were terminated by the federal government, less than 1% of the original 69,100-acre reservation granted by Presidential Executive Order in 1857 remained in tribal ownership. Over the course of almost 100 years, the more than 27 Native American tribes and bands that comprise the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde saw their land slowly whittled away by deception, neglect, and colonial efforts to divest Indian people of their property and rights by state and federal governments. After 21 years of termination, all that remained of the reservation was approximately 5 acres. But it was not always so. Members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon descend from proud people who populated the vast territory of Western Oregon, southwestern Washington, and Northern California since time immemorial, before contact with European explorers and white settlers occurred in the early 19th century. There are more than 27 original tribes and bands that make up the Grand Ronde Confederation, with the central tribes being the Kalapuya, Umpqua, Molalla, Chinook, Rogue River, Tillamook, Shasta, and Chasta. 7 treaties were signed ceding their vast lands to the federal government in the 1850s. The native peoples were then herded together and temporarily relocated to a reservation at Table Rock near present-day Medford, Oregon. But hostilities with local settlers and miners forced relocation under armed guard to the Coast and Grand Ronde reservations. Tribal members were forced marched 263 miles over 33 days in February and March of 1856 to Grand Ronde. Along the way, 8 tribal members died. and 8 children were born. Despite being relocated to the supposed safety of the Grand Ronde Reservation, the assault on the tribe's way of life continued. In 1887, the Dawes Indian Allotment Act led to the loss of major portions of the reservation to non-Indian ownership. In 1901, U.S. Inspector James McLaughlin declared almost 26,000 acres of the reservation surplus and sold it for $1.10 per acre, reducing the reservation to a mere 440 acres. Much of the land was purchased by local timber interests. But in 1954, Congress passed the Western Oregon Indian Termination Act, severing the trust relationship between the federal government and the tribe, ending all federal services 2 years later. After 29 years of termination and almost a decade of work by numerous tribal members to get the Grand Ronde tribe restored to federal recognition, members Marvin Kimsey, Jackie Whistler, Catherine Harrison, her son Frank Harrison, and her daughter Karen Askins traveled to Washington, D.C. in October 1983 to testify before the House of Representatives about restoring the Grand Ronde tribe. After the House and Senate passed the bill, it was sent to President Ronald Reagan, who, on November 22, 1983, signed it into law and made the Grand Ronde a federally recognized tribe once again. The tribe was restored, and the work of rebuilding a nation began. In 1984, the first official post-restoration tribal council was sworn into office. 4 years later, in 1988, President Reagan signed the Grand Ronde Reservation Act into law, returning almost 10,000 acres of the original reservation to the tribe. In 1994, tribal membership voted to pursue gaming as a revenue source and used land that the tribe had purchased on Highway 18 on which to build Spirit Mountain Casino, which opened in October 1995. With a firm financial base, the tribe began building its membership services and restoring its cultural heritage. And resurrecting the native tradition of potlatch, the tribe created the Spirit Mountain Community Fund. In October 1998, the Governance Center opened and Spirit Mountain Lodge welcomed its first guests. The tribe opened its first elder housing complex in 2000 and opened a new education complex in 2002. In recent years, the tribe has built foster care units to house and support tribal elders, opened housing for both low-income and market-rate rental units for tribal members, and regained sovereignty rights to hunt for ceremonial game. The tribe was instrumental in building the West Valley Veterans Memorial, a tribute to area residents, tribal and non-tribal, who have served in the military.
So great. That is not my whole presentation, but it is a good way to kick it off with all of you. And it might give you some ideas of a video that you might share as a part of your classes when you're just looking for that kind of introductory interview and that or overview, and then getting into conversation. So I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to leave a little bit of room. I'm going to go through this presentation quickly. I generally go through it in about 45 minutes to an hour, but I want to allow a little bit room for questions, and we did the video before. So maybe I had a question here. I also, how things are set up, unfortunately, I can't see chat as they come in. So I'll get chat when we get there. And you'll forgive me, I haven't been teaching via Zoom all year long like many of you, so you're probably pros at this stuff by now.
The biggest question we're getting, David, right now is how they get a link to that video.
Okay. You know, I think that it's a video that I've used, but I'm sure that it's something that we can put up on YouTube, and I can work with Justine on that through the putting it up on the tribe's YouTube channel. So that's probably what we'll do. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Justine, can you see the main slider? Do you see presenter view? Oh, you're muted.
Oh, I see the main slide.
Okay, perfect. All right, so the tribe. This presentation goes over pre-relocation, removal, reservation life, post-termination, tribal restoration. And then at the end, there's a little bit of talk about tribal government, the map, and some annual events, kind of similar to that video that you just watched. So when we talk about the tribe's homelands and those 27 tribes and bands, we're talking about a really large area of Western Oregon. This is a map of Western Oregon. It's a shape that you probably don't recognize because most people don't spend time looking at the outer bounds of 7 treaties that were signed in the 1850s. But that's what that black line is. If you combined all 7 treaty areas, it fills in that shape. The areas in light green are just kind of showing that Native people didn't just stay within their treaty areas. There's documentation of people going outside of that. And then the green areas are areas that we call unceded land, which means there was no treaty signed for those areas, but tribal people from those places came to the Grand Ronde Reservation, which is in red on this map. The little light green area is the size of the reservation today. And the red is the historic 69,000 acre reservation. So one question that I regularly get is, well, how long have tribal people been here? And we say since time immemorial, which means since a time that no one can remember. The thing that we'll get into is that we as tribal people have pretty long memories. Archaeologists say that it's at least been 14,000 years based on the archaeological material that we've found in our homelands. But to us, we go to time immemorial. And the oldest geological event that our people remember, anthropologists recorded it from our elders in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was the flooding of the Willamette Valley. And on the right is essentially in blue the outline of the Willamette Valley. But this is what the valley would look like if there was 400 feet of water in the valley. So up on the top of the screen in the dark blue, you have the Columbia River. Just south of that, there's a little piece of land that looks like a isthmus, and that would be Forest Park today above Portland. Of course, the Portland airport and all of East Portland would be flooded. And then you go throughout the valley, and up north you have Chehalem Ridge, you have the Eola Hills, the Salem Hills. So that's what you're looking at on the right. On the left is a meteorite. And you might ask, why are these two things connected? Well, it's presumed, so this is Tamanoas. It's a sacred object to us as a people, and it's the largest meteorite ever found in North America. And it was actually found near West Lynn, Oregon, which is odd because there isn't a huge impact crater where West Lynn is. And what's presumed is that it's actually this flood event that brought this sacred object to this area. And it was something that historically venerated, was a sacred object by the Clackamas people. But when settlers came, it eventually made its way. And today it's in Manhattan, in the state of New York, downtown Manhattan. And it's the centerpiece of the Museum of Natural History's planetarium, all about science. And we send a delegation back each year. I know Justine's been involved with that and many other people at the tribe. And it's a really important part of our history. When Chichalu opens back up, you can actually see a 1-to-1 replica of Tamanoas in the exhibit hall here at Chichalu, which is the tribe's museum. I won't go as much into this, but some of those tribal group names that you saw in the video, they're from different specific areas of the homelands. So we have the tribes near the Columbia River, near Portland today. This is the drawing of the interior of a plank house or one of our living structures. You see the pit floor in the middle, and you see the art, the different Columbia River style art in the back. And this is a painting also by Paul Kane of the Willamette Valley. And, notice there's no big square fields or other things of that sort. And it's because our ancestors burned quite regularly, and scholars and academics and others have actually referred to the people of the Willamette Valley, the Kalapuya, is practicing a pyroculture. And even in this painting, often missed, if you look up on the hills in the back, there's a large column of smoke that's coming off the hills, which is indicative of some fall burning practices. So Kalapuya, one thing that's really helpful, it's kind of by coincidence, I guess, but the names of our ancestors are still written on the landscape. Many rivers within Oregon are named after the tribal people that lived in those watersheds. And so these names might be familiar to you, and oftentimes it's because they're the people of the watersheds that have been named after them. Down in the Umpqua Basin, you have Athabascan and Takelma speaking people, as well as Molalla and Kalapuya. So one thing that's often missed is that Oregon was an extremely linguistically diverse place before settlers arrived. There was actually over 5 major language families represented, and those languages were as different from each other as Chinese and French. They weren't like all a part of the same language family, the way we think of Romance languages like Spanish or French or Italian. So, you know, to give that idea, we actually have that many languages in Kalapuya, right? There's not just one Kalapuya language. There's actually 3 language families of Kalapuya with multiple dialects of those languages within the Kalapuya language family. So these are some of the bands from the Rogue River. You know, one thing that happens both on the reservation among tribal members as well as generally in history is there were all these tribal people that fought this war that became known as the Rogue River Indian War. And so the different tribal groups that fought in that war kind of identify them, their descendants identify them today as Rogue River, but also local people do. But before the Rogue River Indian War, there weren't really Rogue River Indians. They had different names, and some of those names are like the Takelma, the Doctibi, the Galise, the Daltunkte, the Applegates, the Upper Lutgowa, I'm sorry, the Upper Takelma. So you get all these names. It's kind of like how there wasn't a Grand Round reservation until, or there wasn't a Grand Round people until the Grand Round reservation was created. And some of the Tillamook people from the coast. And this is a picture of the mouth of the Salmon River and Cascade Head, which is a important preserved ecological area today. And if you ever get the chance to go to Camp Westwind, which is here on the Sand Spit side of the river, it's a really special place. You also have Sitka Center is out here at the mouth of the Salmon River, which does a lot of great art and scholar residencies. So removal. So you heard a little bit about the Trail of Tears. The most prominent Trail of Tears was that Trail of Tears from Medford area. But tribal people were removed from across the tribe's homelands in Western Oregon to temporary reservations, and then eventually to the Grand Round Reservation. A few of those temporary encampments are places like at Dayton, where General Joel Palmer, who negotiated the treaties, where he lived, he had an encampment on his property, and there were a number of others throughout the valley. Treaty making wasn't just one and done. There were different treaty efforts that go back as early as the late 1840s, but really 1851. 51 is the first round of formalized treaties known as Anson Dart treaties. And those treaties, while negotiated in good faith with tribal people, never resulted in ratification by the government. And so they weren't recognized. And that's what required another round of treaties from 1853 to 55. And those are the ratified treaties. For most of the Willamette Valley, which I imagine most of you are logging in from, it's one of the largest treaty areas in Western Oregon. There's a treaty called the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, or the Kalapuya Etc. Treaty. And you had the Kalapuya people, the Molalla, and then different ethnically Chinook people, their bands. So the Clackamas, the Multnomah, the Cascades, the Oregon City Band of Tumwater, or the Clawley-Walla as they were known. All those people signed the Willamette Valley Treaty and were removed to the reservation at Grand Round. So the reservation was established as 69,000 acres. That's that map up on the top of this screen. And then you have some pictures of tribal members in front of a really large log. And it took about 3-4 generations, but eventually the railroad came out to Grand Round, and Grand Round really developed into, like many small rural towns in Oregon, a timber town filled with mills. And that has really been the primary industry for at least 100 years in the community of Grand Round until the casino was constructed. This is a quote that I have here from the commissioner. It's a report from the Indian agent at Grand Round in 1871 back to DC. And he's saying, "You would be ashamed if the Indians could write the truth to Washington themselves. When the money and things arrive, here they go into the storehouse and the Indians never see them. So with all the agents, they never give us what is sent for." And this is one of those sentiments that's being expressed of broken treaties, broken promises. Treaties were signed and things were supposed to happen and they didn't. And to a certain extent, those types of activities are still going on today. And I think that when people ask, what can we do, to support tribal people, a big part of it is honor the treaties, right? Ensure that the treaty is seen as not only our treaty, but seen as everyone's treaty that lives in our homelands, right? Right of title for any property in Western Oregon or within the Willamette Valley begins with the agreement that was signed with our ancestors. And so the fulfillment of that is very important, and the promises that were made in those treaties. So sadly, the furthest break from fulfilling any promises was when the government formally said that they weren't going to fulfill any of those promises, which is sort of what termination was. To put that in context, especially for a lot of you social studies history teachers, it's not a coincidence that it happened in 54. If you place this within American history, this is a period of time of McCarthyism. It's a time of the fear of the other, the sentiments of the Cold War, and this idea of capitalism versus communism. The concern that was existing was that tribal people would be a foothold for communism in America, and that in order to avoid this ability to have some sort of separate sovereign or organized entity within the US government, the government needed to end recognition of those entities as a part of its efforts to combat communism and the Soviet Union. And so the first step of that plan was executed, and the tribes of Western Oregon were terminated. It was actually a 3-part plan. And if all 3 parts were completed, all the tribes in the United States would have been terminated. But this thing happened in the 1960s, which was a huge civil rights era movement, and public sentiment swung the other way. Sadly, we were terminated at that time, and it's a reason why a lot of people who grew up in Oregon from the 1950s, even into I'd say the 90s, didn't know that Grand Round existed, because when they asked where the tribes in Oregon were, they heard names that were far away, like Warm Springs or Umatilla, tribes that weren't terminated. And so, a part of that exists because when the tribe was restored in 83, we had nothing, right? We had to begin all over again. We had to acquire land. We had to build a government. We were nation building from the ground up. And it took us probably, I'd say, about 15 years. And then really only 20 years was a lot of that accomplished, where we began to be involved further out in the community besides our locale, because of the funds and the revenues that were generated from the casino. So we have a tribal council. The tribal government today is run by, has a general council and elects 9 leaders that serve 3-year terms. We have elections every single year, and 3 people are up for election. So these are our current seated tribal council. There are no term limits. Within the community of Grand Round, this is kind of some individual locations, like a map. I can also make this PowerPoint available to anyone, and I'll provide it to Justine as well if you have an interest in using it. Most people know Spirit Mountain Casino, which is down in your lower right-hand corner. That's what you see when you drive by the highway. Very few people really turn onto Grand Round Road, which is a road that links Highway 18 and 22. And that's where most of all of the tribe's infrastructure today exists. The only other areas would be like our powwow grounds where our plank house is. It's actually on the way up to Fort Yamhill. So if you ever wanted to go take a look or you were driving out to the coast, you just enter in the directions to go to Fort Yamhill State Park, and you would drive through the tribe's powwow grounds and plank house. And then, you know, we have a number of annual public events throughout the year when it's not COVID times. And these are all open to individuals like yourself or your students. We have our Grand Round Agency round dance, which is in the winter time. And a way to know like when these are would just be to follow tribal social media or put in a request to our newspaper, Smoke Signals, to receive PDF copies of the newspaper. And there's announcements about these events made in those locations. First fish ceremony happens at Willamette Falls in May. We haven't been able to do it yet, but Tribal Council has indicated they want us to do that event on the tribe's newly acquired Blue Heron site, the property that the tribe owns at the falls in Oregon City. We have First Foods hosted by our culture committee. It often happens at our plank house and is an opportunity to try roots and berries and teas and different meat and traditional foods. We have a Veterans Summit and Powwow that happens in July. Grand Round Contest Powwow is the third weekend in August. Our Plank House birthday, when we open up the house for winter storytelling and songs and celebration, happens the third weekend in October. We have a History and Culture Summit, which is designed kind of for our partners that we're actively working with, but it's organized a little bit different, but more like a conference presenter format every other year, and then a special topic every other year. And then we have a Grand Round Restoration Day when our tribe was restored. In addition, of course, we have our Education Summit, which you are all here, so I do not have that on this presentation deck. And it's a great way to connect with everybody. That's what I have. And I magically left only 4 minutes. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to present. If you are interested in contacting Chichalu, the number for Chichalu, and you can just call the main tribe as well, but it's 503-879-2226. And yeah, I'll open up and look at the chat bar. Oh, looks like we have some other volunteers at different events. Muck Muck Mania. Yeah, that's an event that's put on by the food pantry that's associated with the community here. Also a good event to get connected. Run also, so the organizers of that are also involved in First Foods, so kind of similar. I think there was a comment about U of O. There is an art installation of the meteorite that was done by one of our partners, who's an artist, Garrick Imitani, who teaches at PNCA in Portland. And yeah. Well, I just want to, without any other questions that come in, I just want to say I'm really appreciative of all the work that you guys are doing and taking on something like making SB 13 meaningful to students. One thing that I haven't said is there's only 5,500 tribal members. We only have maybe a few hundred that would feel comfortable talking or presenting in front of a group. And meanwhile, we have maybe as many schools as there are tribal members in the tribe's entire homelands. So it's not possible for us even programmatically, if we were able to build a program to really do all the work that needs to be done. We need advocates and allies to help us and talk about the story that isn't just ours, but is also Oregon's. And I would introduce a term of landcestor. So this idea that the people of this place are my ancestors, but if you're making a place your home and you're coming to know what that is, you can learn about people as your landcestors, right? Like you can have an attachment and belonging. And I think that has been a term that's kind of helped me and, the rancher of 5 generations, or my wife's family who came across the Oregon Trail, figure out how we're all connected to this place and how we can kind of make common cause with each other.